Bob Giles has just published a new book, When Truth Mattered, a memoir of his time as editor at the Akron Beacon Journal and his team of reporters' coverage of the Kent State shootings 50 years ago. He's with us today on World Press Freedom Day, speaking to the International Affairs Forum. Bob was the curator of the Nieman Journalism Fellowship at Harvard for 11 years, has decades under his belt as editor at various local newspapers, and is on the, I believe it's the editorial board of the Record Eagle, and lives in Northport, and really can offer a wealth of experience of a history of American journalism and its importance to all of us.
Okay, well, on New Year's Eve in 2002, a brave journalist from Zimbabwe, along with his wife and two teenage children, made a daring escape across the border to South Africa. His name was Jeff Nyroda, and he was the founder of the Daily News, which was Zimbabwe's most widely read newspaper and a forceful critic of the country's president, Robert Mugabe. Jeff had become a target in a campaign by Mugabe's government to discredit and silence criticism from independent news outlets. His newspaper, the Daily News, had built a wide audience for its independent reporting and aggressive efforts to uncover corruption and human rights abuses. During his tenure as editor, Jeff had been arrested numerous times and taken into custody, and his paper's printing presses and offices had been bombed. And a new licensing law in Zimbabwe gave the government power to close any newspaper. And that became a weapon to force the Daily News management to fire its courageous editor. The day Jeff Nyroda and was dismissed from as editor, the National Police came looking for him, and he and his family narrowly escaped, but he knew he could not remain hidden in South Africa. And so he contacted me through the Committee to Protect Journalists. And after a long conversation at the Nieman Foundation with Jeff and encouragement from his colleagues, I offered him sanctuary as a Nieman Fellow. And he and his family arrived in Boston on a cold January day with only the airline blankets for warmth. His presence at Harvard called attention to the brutally repressive regime in Zimbabwe that had failed to silence him. Jeff Nyroda had the courage to find his voice and speak freely where free speech was not welcome. So Jeff Nyroda is but one of several international journalists in the Nieman Fellowship program at Harvard, whose stories of escape and survival often brought tears to the eyes of others seasoned journalists in the program who listened to these heroic stories. And so a day to celebrate the courageous journalists around the world who take great personal risk to inform us is at the heart of World Press Freedom Day. To me, it's a day for all citizens to reaffirm their support of the ideals of a free press, an ideal that enables citizens of free democratic societies to benefit from independent journalism. The ideal of a free press also emboldens citizens and journalists to fight back against efforts to silence them. Authoritarian regimes have introduced forms of control that threaten journalism's traditional role of giving the public stories based on reliable facts, truthful information, inclusive points of view, and a diversity of cultural expressions.
Thank you so much. And Bob, thanks for all that you have done and continue to do to protect journalists, to further journalism at Nieman, for your work in Michigan and in the Midwest to further journalism. And congratulations on your book. Tell us about briefly about When Truth Mattered and what inspired you to write this book.
Thank you. I wrote When Truth Mattered because I want people to understand how truth and trust shaped my newspaper, the Akron Beacon Journal, in its effort to find the truth about the shooting of students at Kent State. 4 dead students and 9 with bullet wounds. It was a stark message that the war had come home, that it had changed the way we thought about Vietnam. In that one instant of 13 seconds when 61 shots were fired by soldiers of the Ohio National Guard. And I wanted readers of my book to meet the truth tellers in our newsroom. Sadly, most of them have died. But on May 4th and the weeks afterwards, they created a truthful narrative of a terrible event, and they got it right. And so my book focuses on the story of how my newspaper fulfilled its mission, the challenges it met, and the standards it upheld in covering the story of the shootings, and then through our investigative reporting revealed several mistakes or inappropriate behaviors by public officials, high public officials, that contributed to the environment in which the National Guard soldiers could shoot unarmed students.
Thanks. When looking back 50 years now, in hindsight, while writing your memoir, what did you learn? What surprised you about your team's coverage of the shootings and the aftermath that wasn't maybe apparent in the early 70s?
Well, what surprised me, what I learned, first, it reinforced my belief that the role of a news organization, in part, is to build trust with its readers over a long period of time. The stories out of Kent State that we reported were not necessarily welcomed by our readers. But they accepted the facts. They trusted our stories. They believed that we gave them the best available version of the truth, even though the facts in those stories were not necessarily welcomed by our readers. I was stunned at the reality of soldiers dressed in combat uniforms and with M1 weapons, a killer weapon, shooting unarmed students on their own college campus who were simply trying to express their First Amendment rights of assembly and free speech. And I was also surprised at how quickly the leadership of the Ohio National Guard tried to shift the blame from shooting the students to the protesters. And I was surprised that over time, the commander of the National Guard at Kent State continued to deny responsibility for the basic command functions, which are expected of an officer in charge of his troops. And it also taught me that the values of preparation. We had been covering occasional disturbances on the Kent State campus since the mid-1960s. We had sources, we had records, and we had a lot of information. It was an institutional understanding of the background. And so when the shooting occurred, we were well prepared to go to our sources and obtain truthful information. And then during those challenging and emotional days, the dedication of my reporters was simply outstanding. They were tired, they were emotionally involved. I mean, many of the students who were hurt, some who were killed, they knew them because these were journalism graduates of Kent State Journalism School. And their dedication was extraordinary, and as was their persistence in chasing down leads, deciding what was true and what was not true, and preparing a truthful account for our readers over quite a long period of time.
That's great. So they were prepared. They understood the environment. They had contacts. They had some trust. That said, what were some of the acute challenges or hurdles they faced, your team faced in reporting this story?
Well, one of the challenges, of course, was immediately after the shooting. Within hours, the campus was closed. So that meant you had 19,000 students rushing to grab buses and cars and so on to go home. There was an element of fear in the air because nobody knew whether there was going to be more shooting. There had been early reports that there had been a sniper, and it took us 3 days to investigate that claim and disprove it by doing a test on a metal sculpture. There was a metal sculpture right next to the shooting site that had a bullet hole in it. And the National Guard claimed that the pattern of the bullet going through the sculpture indicated that the shot came from the students. Well, we did our own test and we proved that just the opposite. Well, those are kinds of things that we did that helped shape the public understanding over time, which basically said the students died in vain. The National Guard had no reason to shoot them. Their lives were not in danger. And our ability to come to those conclusions and to help public understand that's what had happened was built on extensive reporting, tracking, for example, the behavior of the governor of Ohio was critical. At that moment, Jim Rhodes, the governor, had come to Kent on Sunday, the day before the shooting, because he was on a campaign tour. He was running for the Republican nomination for the U.S. Senate in the primary election on the Tuesday after the shooting, what would be the shooting. That was May the 5th. And Jim Rhodes came to Kent. The president of the university was out of town on an educational mission. The governor took charge without consulting anybody. And one of the early things he did was to meet with the county prosecutor and other county officials. And the prosecutor urged him in the strongest language to shut down the university. That was Sunday. Well, you can imagine shutting down the university on Sunday would have meant nobody would likely have been killed on Monday. And then he made a fiery speech in which he said the protesting students were the worst kind of people we have in our country. They're worse than the Nazi brown shirts. I mean, that was a very incendiary, set of comments. And of course, the students resented it. Students also resented the fact that the National Guard soldiers were on their campus. They thought, that's our campus. We don't want to have armed soldiers on the campus. And then the governor finally gave instructions to the National Guard commanders that said, on Monday, when a student rally was planned around noon, there will be no gathering, no assembly of students, peaceful or otherwise. And some aggressive reporter said, Governor, what do you mean by an assembly of students? And he said, two people walking together. He really didn't want anybody protesting against the war. And when people pressed him again for why didn't you close the campus on Sunday when you had the chance, he said, well, if we had closed the campus, then the opponents, my opponents would have said, well, the radicals won. He let the radicals win by closing down the campus. So it was a tragic set of a tragic sequence of events that led to this confrontation at noon during the student rally on Monday.
So tragic, but bravo to you and your team at the Beacon Journal for covering this. I wanted to ask, you alluded a little bit earlier to reporting on stories where maybe your readership, the general public, might find themselves initially on a different side, or they might perhaps recoil or be reticent initially to face inconvenient truths. That seems like a dilemma that journalists face today as well. Could you talk a bit about that? I mean, reporting on stories that are hard for the general public to accept?
Well, we're right in the midst of one such story, which is the coronavirus. In initial reporting, there was a lot of misinformation or disinformation, deliberately misinforming the public for purposes that had nothing to do with truth-telling. But over time, the dedicated journalists in the mainstream press, and when I say the mainstream press, I'm talking about such news organizations as NPR, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, the wire services, CNN, the major television networks, and the local press. I've excluded Fox News because they clearly have a biased perspective on the story and they continue to pursue it. These news organizations have realized that the truth-telling comes from relying as sources on the experts, the people who can speak with authority on what the epidemic is all about, what the possibilities for a vaccine are, and many other things. And the press that has been relying on such authoritative sources is really doing a terrific job of telling the public the truth as much as we're able to give it to them. And I think that's a great sign of how the value of journalism has come into play in informing all of us. I mentioned local news. The big news organizations are not going to be interested or able to cover what's going on in your local hospital or the path of the disease as it goes through the community. You have to rely on the local newspapers and local broadcast outlets for that kind of information. And as long as those stories are based on interviews and sourcing with people who know what's going on, people who know about the science, people who know about the virus, the public is going to be reasonably well informed.
Yeah. Thanks for steering us toward the coronavirus. That's obviously the daily menu, unfortunately. Yeah, I mean, societies are almost entirely shut down. We're communicating via Zoom and online. We're not gathering in places. We're not interviewing sources in coffee shops or in their homes. How has the coronavirus, COVID-19 pandemic how is it affecting world press freedom in the United States and elsewhere?
Well, I like to cite China as an example of the challenge that we face. In March, which was during the early days of the epidemic, Chinese government wanted to claim victory in what their leaders were describing as the people's war against the virus. And President Xi led a sweeping campaign attempting to purge dissent, censoring news reports, harassing citizen journalists, and shutting down news sites. But the Chinese journalists at that moment were encouraged by an outpouring of support from the public and the widespread call for free speech. And they fought back in a rare challenge to the ruling Communist Party. And now, Chinese journalists are publishing a series of hard-hitting exposés describing government cover-ups and failures in the public health care system. And they are circulating passionate calls for press freedom, and are using social media to draw attention to the injustice and abuse that comes from their communist system.
You mentioned some of the major news outlets here in the United States that are doing an excellent job covering the coronavirus pandemic. I was wondering if you have any, I don't know, specific examples on your mind of stories or series of stories or reporters that you've been following who have done an exemplary job of covering this, perhaps have employed different or unique strategies, given that we're living in different times, to cover this, to tell this story?
Well, this is where resources come into play. And I, without any disrespect to other news organizations, I think the New York Times has done an extraordinary job. But the Times has hundreds of reporters that they can put on this story. And many of these reporters have special knowledge of science, of medicine. They've been covering these stories for a long time, and they can write with authority. But you also see the creativity that the editors and the artists and the photographers are bringing to the story in some of the page one graphics and the charts that indicate what is going on, and give readers an opportunity to simply open the paper and study this information for its revealing aspects. And that it's just an extraordinary piece of journalism that I don't think is being matched anywhere, even though other newspapers like the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal are doing quite extraordinary work in bringing doing innovative reporting and bringing unpublished information to their readership.
I'm going to go off script here and ask a question I just thought of. If you were an editor at the moment today, what if you were meeting with your news staff, your reporters, what particular story or angle or approach might you assign them as a way to cover the impact of the coronavirus in their community?
One of the things that I would be interested in exploring is the impact of learning at home. You know, here we are talking through Zoom. There's a lot of online learning of this kind going on in the country. There's also a new dimension of how citizens as patients can talk to their physicians. Some who have the virus, some who are just getting their regular physical checkups. And the question of whether this kind of communication through Zoom or FaceTime or Skype, whatever, can create an environment in which patients feel more comfortable having a conversation with their doctor, and whether it leads to people being more willing to follow the doctor's instructions, take their medications or whatever. I think that's a kind of an unexplored story. Another story that I kind of worry about has been the attention that's been focused on the meatpacking plants in South Dakota and Nebraska and so on. My question is, because so many of the meat packers in those plants have become infected with the virus, what happens to the meat products that they've been handling? Does the meat carry the virus, or does freezing it make a difference, or packing it in cellophane and plastic wraps make a difference? It's a sort of an open question in my mind that I'd like to know the answer to.
Absolutely. I mean, this pandemic, and the subsequent societal shutdown, of course, has affected literally everything about our lives. And so I suppose it also means it's a golden opportunity for journalism, for storytelling, to show a world changing under our feet.
Absolutely. People who are in charge of elected officials and what have you are kind of shy and resistant to bad news that reflects somehow negatively on their leadership or their vision or their ability to be transparent. And the press just has to keep pressing and pressing and pressing through its independent reporting, and then pressing through well-framed and hard-asked questions. And that will make a difference over time in what the public comes to know and understand about this terrible disease.
Bob, what will you tell aspiring young journalists today who want to hone the craft? What would you tell them?
I would tell them that journalism has never been more important in our lives, and it's a great opportunity for entrepreneurial young and hardworking young people who love to write and gather information and ask questions. Now, I say that at a time when newspapers are shrinking, and when I talk about the need to do expansive coverage of the virus, it's happening at the same time when you're reading stories about news organizations laying off people or furloughing reporters and so on, which really diminishes their capacity to bring the resources to covering a very complex story. So it's a conundrum, and the fact that the economics of printed newspapers have become so fraught that you just have to hope that the major publications and the big wire services and so on can sustain this incredible effort they're making to give us all the information that's available, recognizing that not every news organization now has the capacity to do the in-depth reporting that is required to tell this story effectively.
Bob, we've been so grateful to speak with you today and in commemoration of World Press Freedom Day and about so much more. Any closing thoughts?
Well, it's such an important time, and in my privileged years as a curator of the Nieman Foundation at Harvard, I met so many courageous, heroic international journalists who came to Harvard with PTSD, stress-related problems, growing out of their exposure to terrible, terrible situations. We had a number of programs at the Nieman Foundation to explore the idea of combat stress and post-traumatic stress syndromes and so on. And it was interesting to sit in a room full of 25 or 30 journalists. And after some explanation by a psychiatrist about what PTSD was and so on, how many of them who had been bottling up these emotions and these fears and having nightmares began to speak out and tell their stories. And some of the stories were just so gripping. And it was a great release for them. But it also was an indicator of how difficult it is to have your life at risk every day in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and to carry those fears within you, but not have an outlet to express your experiences. So I think that there's an element there about World Press Freedom Day that is important for the public to think about.
Absolutely. I mean, we're writing the first draft of history, and that draft is often fraught with peril and pain. Thank you so much for what you
My
do.
pleasure.